Welcome back to our series on the study of Revelation. In this episode, we're going to be looking at a bit of the historical context around what was happening at the time. We established in previous episodes that we're looking at a date of around AD 95. And look, it's actually really important that we do understand what's happening for the people at the time. In particular, understanding the major historical developments. If we think of today how COVID has impacted us, historically, it will be fruitless for anyone 2,000 years from now to want to understand what the people of the early 21st century would, dealing with if they don't talk about something like COVID and the impact it's had on us, or understanding even the world wars or the Cold War and how that's impacting, a lot of the political or the geopolitical situation, especially in Europe at this moment with the war in the Ukraine. So it's important for us, if we're going to be looking at the book of Revelation and we want to understand the language used, is to understand the historical developments of the time. But it's also important to understand the cultural developments of the time. Again, looking at the late 20th, early 21st century, if you're studying that to 2,000 years from now, you need to understand how social media is impacting us, or how movies, TV, media, these things, how they actually impact our culture and our language. And it would be funny if 2,000 years from now they're looking at some historical documents and they read a statement from us saying, "Yeah, it was really cool, man. Hey, wasn't it?" And people in 2,000 years from now take that literally and start to think, "Oh yeah, they spoke a lot about the temperature being cold or cooler than normal." It seems like they say that often, rather than actually understanding the slang or the term being cool as okay or pretty good. Um, so that's why it's so important to understand the cultural developments, because the language means something. It will mean something different to us in our context, but it can mean something completely different to the people in the first century in their context. And furthermore, understanding the political influences of the time, it would be, I think, an error of any historical evaluation of the 21st century without considering the impact of somebody like Donald Trump and his presidencies had, not just on America, but on the world. And we talk about the history of Rome, for example. We're going to get into that in a little bit, but there's a great book titled "The Mortal Republic," and in it, the author makes this comparison between, Rome from the Republic becoming, basically a dictatorship, and saying there are very many parallels in America today, in American society. And he draws on one event in particular, which kind of then signaled what most historians would signal was the end or the beginning of the end of the Republic of Rome. The incident occurring to these two brothers, they were called the Gracchi brothers. But in some ways, if we think about Trump's presidency, something like, the storming of the Capitol, it will be looked back as an event in which something major has changed in society, especially in American society. But in worldwide society, we see that in many parts of the world, how that impacts us. So, we can see that today as we live through the history. So we need to understand some of those political influences of the time and how they impact us, or what we're reading, and impacted the people of the first century. Now, if we go to what the empire, the Roman Empire, looked like in that first century, right about, a few years after Jesus was born, you can see the empire there in that dark purple color. And in the 100 years leading from that, it grew to what amounted to be its largest size, the biggest it'll ever get. And it covered pretty much the majority of the Mediterranean world. And one thing you need to know about the culture of the time, that most people there lived within shooting distance of the ocean, because trade was easier that way, and so the largest communities were close, generally close to the ocean. So that map there that you see, especially as the Roman Empire entered into that second century, that includes quite a lot of people, a large population. Of course, at the center of it all is Rome. It was the first city in history to record a population of more than 1 million. It was by far and away the largest city in the known world at that time. But there were other cities as well that were very important, that had some strong influence on the world around it. Athens in particular, the Romans could not seem to eliminate Greek culture. It had been so embedded within the world at the time. So the Romans adopted their gods, the Greek gods, and just renamed them in Roman terms: Jupiter, Mars. They couldn't take it over, so they just renamed them to make it easier on people. That's how strong the influence of the Greek world was, or the Greek culture was, on the world. But also down south in Alexandria. Now we think of Egypt and we think of Cairo and we think of the pyramids and all, but actually Alexandria was the center of Egypt. That is where the seat of Pharaoh. Well, we wouldn't really call them Pharaoh, but today, because at that time, in that first century, Egypt was actually Greek. When Alexander the Great died, he divided up his empire, and the Ptolemies, Ptolemy, one of his generals, was given charge of Egypt and that southern region there. And so when we come to that first century, and the most famous of Egyptians, Cleopatra, wasn't actually Egyptian. She was most certainly of Greek descent. And in fact, she wasn't the first Cleopatra. Cleopatra, it was a title given to any woman who would have taken on kind of that familiar role of Pharaoh. And if you're a male, you were called Ptolemy. If you're female, you're called Cleopatra. So I think Cleopatra was like the seventh or eighth one, the famous one that Elizabeth Taylor portrayed in the movies, who was impregnated by Julius Caesar, and then who also joined Mark Antony in rebelling against Octavian, the rightful heir of Julius Caesar. And let's not forget Jerusalem. I mean, we are looking at the Bible. We are talking about a lot of things from also a Jewish perspective in particular. And Jerusalem was an important city, even though it was in a small corner of the world. To our narrative, to what we're looking at in the book of Revelation, Jerusalem is front and center. So we cannot leave that out. And then, there's the famous seven churches, and you can see them all scattered within a very concentrated region of this Roman map. And, the dots aren't exactly pinpointing where the cities are, but they give you an indication of where they all are in what we would call today modern Turkey. But that region where those seven churches are, it's actually a very rich region. If you go back to the Old Testament, that's where the Hittite Empire was based, and not only that, but when the Assyrians came through and wiped through that area, they repopulated it with different peoples from other regions, and then the Persians came through, and then the Greeks came through, and then the Romans, and regions around it that were quite rich in trade, because they had a connection with the East. And so it was a very multicultural area. It was a melting pot of various cultures that all coming together in that region. So it was a very rich region, and that is, again, going to be the center of a lot of what we're going to talk about in the next few episodes as we touch on the seven churches. Now, as we move forward, we're going to take a step back and go into a little bit of Roman history. And while I'm not going to talk about the fall of the Republic and how the emperor kind of came into being, in a sense, I do want to start with a man that did ultimately make all the changes. He wasn't the one that actually caused the changes. The changes in Rome, how it came from being a republic, much like very similar to the system where we see in the United States right now. In fact, their republic has been built a lot on the basis of a lot of the Roman ideals of how a society should be formed. Um, but by the time Julius Caesar came to power, so much had been eroded in that republican government system that it was easy really for Julius Caesar to take charge of what was becoming a large power vacuum. And this man is a genius in so many ways. He was a great commander, a great politician, a very smart man. But Rome bred that kind of person because to be Roman meant that you had to fight and to make a name for yourself. And so when generations of that happening, you end up producing the likes of a Pompey or a Caesar. Um, and these guys impacted society completely. And in Rome, Julius Caesar basically changed the world, became an emperor when he finally defeated Pompey. And it came to a point where just because he was the emperor didn't mean that he had complete control. The Senate still operated, and there were a few people that were grumbling at the kind of control Caesar had. And then on the 14th of March, actually, 15th of March, 44 BC, and then known as the Ides of March, Julius Caesar was going to the portico of the Theatre of Pompey, which is ironic since he was the one that defeated Pompey. It was at the gate of the entrance into the Theatre of Pompey, named after the great man where Julius Caesar met his own demise. But they were meeting there because the Senate itself was under construction. They were rebuilding certain elements of it, so they were forced to meet in a different space. And if you go to Rome today, you can actually go to the place where he was murdered. Now, when he did, when he was killed, a couple of years later, when Octavian became emperor, he had the whole place literally filled with concrete as a testimony that no one's to go into that space ever again in honor of Julius Caesar, because it was a place of treachery. It was a place where traitors had betrayed the Roman people. And you can actually, as they're digging there, they found the big, large pile of concrete, which obviously designates the place, the entrance, the portico of the Theatre of Pompey. And so when Julius Caesar died, the 12 seers of Rome, who worked predominantly with the Pontifex Maximus, which is the high priest of Rome, which was a very symbolic role. He made sure that the religious duties of the Romans were fulfilled. He made sure that the Vestal Virgins were doing their job, and made sure that the forum was appropriate in the way it addressed the crowds and so on. It was even though it was a formal role per se, it still was a very important role. But the 12 seers, they worked for the Pontifex Maximus. When Julius Caesar died, they pronounced that a comet had streaked across the sky, and that comet was Julius Caesar being raised up into the heavens to take his seat amongst the gods. 2 years later, after a bloody civil war in which three elements, the traitors who killed Julius Caesar as one faction, Mark Antony, who was Julius Caesar's right hand man, along with his partnership with Cleopatra, the two of them got together as one, and then Octavian, who was Julius Caesar's heir, who Caesar had adopted as his son and had passed on in his will the leadership to. Octavian ended up winning that battle. He defeated Brutus and the traitors, and then defeated also Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. When he was pronounced emperor, he actually took it a step further and said that 12 seers is not enough for the for that role of Pontificus Maximus, then there must be 24 seers now, because we have a God in heaven, and on the space where Julius Caesar was actually cremated publicly, they built a temple known as the Temple of Caesar, or also known as the Temple of the Comet. And in return, the 24 seers gave Octavian a new name, Augustus, and they gave him a title, and that title was Imperator Caesar Divi Filius Augustus. That means Emperor Caesar, son of God, and his name Augustus. And so basically, Augustus was the son of the god Caesar, and was referred to as the Son of God. There's a lot of those words that you're going to hear that will click as I go through the history, because they are words that are not new to the people of the first century, but to those of us who read Revelation, they're like, oh, it's in the book of Revelation. That makes sense. But, we don't actually associate that to the everyday language of the people. When someone said Son of God, today we would, as Christians, think of Jesus. But if you're in the first century, you would have thought of, especially early first century, you would have thought of Augustus. You would have thought of the emperor, because each emperor took on that same title, Imperator Caesar Divi Filius. That's because the spirit of Caesar then transitions into the next emperor. There's a lot of imagery that's important for us to understand here. Now, that said, there was a famous Roman poet and writer, classical writer. His name is Publius Vergilius Maro, or basically we know him as Virgil. And Virgil had written quite a lot of writings, the most popular being the Aeneid, which still is a famous Roman work of literature. Now, he had written some prophecies in a number of eclogues, several of them actually, and in those, he's talking about, he has this vision of a person who will come and unite everyone, and he will be this Son of God that will arrive. The most famous line in his writings is this one who is to come, the Son of God incarnate, come down to us. Again, when you read that, you think, oh my goodness, that sounds just like, well, that could be Jesus. Well, in fact, actually, many over the last 2,000 years have used Virgil's prophecies, and rather than focusing them in on the emperor himself, as the emperor Augustus had done, and also the 24 seers had done, they used Virgil's words to prove their point that Augustus is God. Christians were like, oh, actually, Virgil was seeing Jesus. And so, it's fascinating that this terminology, the way that things are said, what you read in Revelation isn't actually just endemic. It's not just coming out of Revelation. They're words that people had heard, that Jesus then uses for his own purposes. So the one who is to come, the Son and God incarnate, come down to us, is not Augustus. It's Jesus, right? Anyway, let's get into a bit more of the history. We'll push a little bit forward. We'll speed up a little bit, and we'll go into 64 AD. And in 64 AD, there is actually on the 19th of July in 64 AD, a great fire in Rome happens. And it happens on the watch of the Emperor Nero. Now, Nero was not universally loved, especially by the upper class, the rich, and the Senate. The middle and lower class loved him because he would lavish a lot, and they enjoyed, all the kind of things that he did, all the circuses he had, all the parades that he would do. But the power people despised him. Now, when the fire broke out, I got this picture here from a Christian website actually, which was kind of dissing Barack Obama, and as you could see, every one of the pillars of American society there are on fire, and there's good old Obama playing the fiddle, representing what Nero did apparently when the Rome was burning. It was said that he was playing a fiddle. Um, Actually, he wouldn't have been. There wasn't fiddles at the time for him to play the Roman instrument. He would have played that. He was actually well versed at playing. It's kind of like this little harpsy thing that kind of, yeah, that little thing there, maybe even with that look, right? Um, that's what he would have played, not a fiddle. And that said, the reality is that he actually wasn't in Rome at the time of the fire, which doesn't mean he might not have ordered it to have started. He was actually in Actium on business work for some sort of trade agreements that he was working on at the time, and he wasn't playing his little harpsichord when that was going down. But it is suspicious because the fire broke out in a quarter in the district of Rome that was not far from the Forum or far from the emperor's palace residence, and it burnt that whole area out, destroyed, killed a lot of people as well, and that whole area of Rome was reduced to rubble. He had it cleared, and rather than rebuild some of the houses back, what he did was he built an artificial pond and built a something like a 12 or a 14-foot, depending on whatever sources you might read, statue of himself that he could see from the balcony of his palace down onto. Now, the interesting aspect of that is that the place where he built that and the place where the fire was is right in that famous space called where you find the Colosseum today. In the bottom left of that photo is the Emperor's Palace, and just above it to the left corner is the beginning of the Forum, where people would have walked up to go into the Forum. But from that vantage point of his palace, he could look down into the artificial lake and see his beautiful statue of himself, and he was quite vain. All reports state that he was quite vain, and so it angered the people, and it threw suspicion on him, obviously, because he took advantage of his own people's suffering to build something for his own glory, and ultimately cost him his life. But you can see from the top of that where his palace was, you can just see the top of the Colosseum through the trees there, which I'm not sure those trees would have been there at that time. And he would have had a clear shot view of it and would have been quite happy to see himself up there. This caused quite a lot of issues. Now, he was under a lot of political pressure, Nero, and obviously he could have easily been the one to have caused the Great Fire. But the reality is, in Rome, fires like that happened relatively frequently. For the most part, they could get stopped very quickly if they could get to the fire quickly enough. But if the fire was strong enough, it would always damage certain parts, especially the poorer, more condensed areas of living. So, yes, could he have done it? Absolutely. But we can't be sure. But what we are sure of is that he was under a lot of political pressure. The Senate was not happy with him. The people, the power makers of Rome, were putting a lot of pressure on him. He needed to deflect their anger or their finger pointing, and so he found a group that were easy to blame. And there's this little group called Christians. They had no political representation, and they did weird things. They had there was rumors of them being cannibalistic, eating the body of Christ. They would share things in a manner that was very exclusive. It was just amongst themselves, and so it was easy to look upon them and to pick them out. And so Nero, to try and prove to the Romans that he didn't do this, he began what was the first major persecution of the Christians by the Romans in particular. It was during this period of time of persecution that Paul was martyred in the Mamertine Prism in Rome, and as a Roman citizen, he would have been beheaded, which was basically what the Romans felt was befitting of a Roman citizen. Peter himself is thought to be martyred during this time as well. People say that he was crucified outside of Rome in a place where we now find the Basilica of St. Peter's in the Vatican. On that ground, actually, beyond the Tiber River, would have been beyond the walls of Rome. A lot of martyrs, Christians in particular, but also gladiators, their bodies were, rather than being thrown into the river, they were dumped into a common burial ground, which was located right, most probably around about where St. Peter's is now. And Peter himself, if he was crucified, his body would have been quite likely dumped in that same region. So not only was Peter buried in that ground, but there would have been a lot of other Christian martyrs also having been buried on that ground. So, as this story evolves, right about this time, something happens in Judea. What happens in AD 66 is the outbreak of what we know as the First Jewish-Roman War. And this was huge. When Jesus was around, they were all waiting for him to start this war against, to lead the Jews back to independence, to overthrow all these nations so that they can stand firm in the favor of God and have their land, their promised land. That's what they waited for in the Messiah. And in 66 AD, war broke out, and actually the Jews initially won a number of important battles against the Romans, especially the Syrian troops, the legions that came out of Syria. They destroyed them. It was a big shock to the Romans in general. And Nero didn't know what to do, but the Senate stepped in and sent their best general at the time, a guy named Vespasian. And Vespasian headed down to Judea to quell this rebellion. And when he arrived, he came from the north down into Galilee, where he confronted the first major battle, led by a general called Josephus. He destroyed the army, but he actually spared Josephus's life. And from this point on, all of our historical details, or the majority that we have on this first Jewish-Roman war, comes straight from Josephus as he writes about everything that happens from here on. So we have quite a lot of detailed information by a person, first-hand account of what was going on there. So this war raged on, and it would rage on for another 5 years, and it will lead to a lot of heartbreak. But in between all of that, 2 years while this war was going into, in AD 68, it was it. I mean, Nero's time was up. The people, or the aristocracy, the Senate, even the Praetorian Guards, they were just turning against him. They've had enough of him. It's unsure whether he committed suicide or whether he got one of his servants to kill him. But Nero dies in AD 68, and civil war breaks out. And I think it's called the Year of the Four Caesars, where they're all fighting over who's going to be the next Caesar. But in that process, they call up, and after the dust settles, and none of those four Caesars last any time or length, the Senate call Vespasian back from Judea and pronounce him emperor of Rome. Vespasian, as he leaves behind his son Titus to finish off the job and deal with the Jews. And he had already laid siege at that point of Jerusalem, and for 2 years Jerusalem, the Romans laid siege to Jerusalem. But Jerusalem didn't fall necessarily because of what the Romans were doing. A lot of their own infighting. Basically, it's civil war broke out within Jerusalem amongst the Jews. So they really are the architects of their own downfall. And so the Romans were able to come in, pillage, and Titus then in AD 70, they destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple grounds, razed it to the ground. Titus himself walked into the temple before it was destroyed and raised the Roman standards there. And yeah, when he came back, his father, who was emperor, um, welcomed his son back and allowed for a big march, a big parade. Um, to commemorate the event. In fact, he built a triumph in his honor. We could see that triumph today as the entrance into the remains of the Forum today. We can see it, and on there's the inscription, as you can see on the side of it, of here is Titus coming through with the standard bearer. You can see on the left in that bottom right photo, the standard bearer is holding up the um, you know the emperors and the Roman standards, with Titus leading in front of that, and then in front of him all the jewels and all the slaves, the Jewish slaves. You can see them tied up in particular in the middle and to the right there. They've been led in procession along with the shofars, the menorah in particular. Um, and all these things, and you can see things there that this was designed 2,000 years ago, and they took all the temple treasures and brought it all back to Rome. They enslaved the Jewish people from Jerusalem, and with the gold that they got out of the temple, with all the riches that they got out of it, and with the Jewish slaves, Vespasian put them to work on his next project, which was to first of all destroy the statue of Nero, and drain the artificial lake and build a monument for the people. And that monument was the Colosseum. It ended up being completed a few years later. But if you've ever been to Rome, if you've ever been to the Colosseum, touch those walls. They were bought with temple gold from that second temple, from Herod's temple. They were bought with the gold that adorned the inside of that temple. They were built, each of those um, uh, granite slates there, all those bricks that were put in there, they were built by Jewish slaves who lived in Jerusalem, who were raised at a time close to the time of Jesus. It kind of puts a different spin on that monument and what the cost was for it to be built. Now, just to kind of take a pause here as we just dwell a little bit on the impact of these Jewish-Roman wars. The first war that we saw ended in 73 AD with the fall of Masada. It's a great story. Read it up. It's quite an interesting story where the Jewish zealots all held out in this fort out by the Dead Sea. That first war ended, and what the result of that was that Jerusalem was destroyed. And though the settlement of Jerusalem still remained, the temple was gone, the temple grounds were destroyed, and so the Jews had lost their temple. And all of a sudden, the synagogue had become for some time, even before Jesus was born. The synagogue had already become a center for Jews to gather. Now it was essential for them, as there was no temple left. The second war happened in 115 to 117 AD, and it was known as the Kitos War, or the Ketos War, sorry, which is the name of the Roman general actually, who defeated the rebellion. The rebellion actually didn't happen in Judea; it happened in Cyprus, where the Jews there basically rebelled. In fact, Kitos War is known as the Rebellion of the Exiles. So they killed quite a few Romans, and so again the Romans sent several legions down to quell the rebellion, and that was the second war. The third war, which was the last war, and that happened in 132 to 136 AD, and it was known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. The name of the person, Simon Bar Kokhba, was known as he was recognized by the Jews in Judea as the Messiah. He led a revolt against the Romans, and look, it was it was most probably the biggest revolt. They'd established certain parts of Judea. They had established as independent states for up to, I think, 2 years. And so the Romans had to send again the legions down there. And at the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, um, the the emperor at the time, which was Emperor Adrian, he'd been dealing with the barbarians in the north, especially after they had taken over, much of Great Britain. But the Scottish people, or the barbarians in the north, ended up building the Hadrian's Wall just because he couldn't deal with them. And so turning to the Jews in particular, he'd had enough of these rebellions, and he wanted Judaism expunged. He wanted it obliterated, and they came close because with the third war he sent down, he literally not only defeated the revolt, but expelled the Jews from the land, wiped the name of Israel from the map, and replaced the name of Israel with the name Palestinia, or Palestine as we know today. And it was, 1900 years later before the Jews would be able to get back and the land be redeclared as Israel. That's the impact that the Roman emperor made sure would happen to the Jews. So, this is important because, in this time, in this period, as you can see after the fall of Masada, the Jews were disquieted by the whole event, and there was a lot going on, and people were thinking it was a Jewish apocalypse, or a Christian apocalypse, or even a Roman apocalypse. They all had this end time worldview that this could not continue, much like we have today. They just felt for the Jews and even for the Christians, this persecution. We're all dying. When's Jesus returning? The Jews were in the same boat. The Romans are destroying us. When's the Messiah coming? And so there was this fervent climate at the time that was, just ripe, as ripe as we are today, I guess. So continuing on, in AD 79, Vespasian dies. The emperor becomes Titus. His son succeeds his father, and Titus had a very short reign as emperor. But during his time, a lot of things happened. For one thing, during his time, the Colosseum was finished, and he opened the games there for the first time. But also Pompeii and the explosion of Mount Pompeii and of Vesuvius, and the destruction of Pompeii happened on his watch. In fact, he was in charge of sending quite a lot of support down, because it wasn't just Pompeii that was destroyed. There were a number of other towns. Herculaneum was a major seaport on the bay there of Naples. That was destroyed as well, in much the same vein as Pompeii. But Pompeii is by far the famous for us today. So there were a number of cities that were destroyed, a number of Roman citizens killed in that. So it happened on his watch. But 2 years later, in AD 81, he died mysteriously. In fact, his last words were, "I have made but one mistake." And a lot of historians believe he's referring to his younger brother, Domitian, who took over from him as emperor. It was the first time where there is a distinct father-son-son succession in Roman emperors. It's known as the Flavian dynasty, maybe because Vespasian's name was Flavius Vespasian. So it was known as the Flavian dynasty. Now, the reason why a lot of suspicion is on Domitian is Domitian was not a military man. His father and brother were. They weren't interested in the honor, in a sense of being or having a title. Their honor came from what they did for Rome, as generals were all driven to be. Their honor wasn't in just personal acclamation, but also in lifting up Rome. Domitian, on the other hand, was actually a very smart man, not a military man. He took care of a lot of the administrative work for his father and brother, but he also had eyes on becoming more than just being in the shadows of his famous father and brother. In fact, it seems as though he most probably pushed to become emperor and wanted the power for himself. And we will be talking quite a lot about Domitian as we go through, because he is by far and away the central figure of the book of Revelation. Now, interestingly enough, when we talk about him, he was quite um, he was emperor for quite some time, and he had some very strong views. One of which was along the lines of resurrecting the idea that he was the Son of God. So he took that title, whereas his father and brother didn't actually take the title that Augustus had laid from that first emperorship. They had just ignored it and moved on. But he got the 24 seers, the priests, to come forward to pronounce upon him the prophecy of Virgil, the one who is to come, the Son of God incarnate. Um, Praise be to the Son of God. Again, words that we take for granted are in the book of Revelation, not thinking that they are actually also in common um, with some of the things that were going on at the time. He instituted a lot of different things. So he instituted emperor worship. He was God, and he alone was to be worshipped. And through that, he also instituted games, the Domitian games, as they were known. Um, One of them, if you've been to Rome again, that's Piazza Navona. And on Piazza Navona, which is actually built upon one of the arenas that Domitian had built for one of his early games in Rome. But he had a difficult time in Rome. The Romans themselves were quite suspicious of Domitian. They did not necessarily like him. The idea of having to worship him as God after having spent so much time not having to deal with Nero anymore, who was himself quite loved the idea of being the Son of God, but then having very pragmatic people like Vespasian and Titus who had no interest in titles. They just wanted to get the job done. And then all of a sudden they're back to this Nero type figure. Domitian found himself spending more and more time away from Rome. Now, it was a common practice at that time that emperors had spaces or places that they would visit or show favor upon, and the place that Domitian found was Ephesus. Ephesus was his place of favor. He gave it his favor. In fact, at the port of when you entered in Ephesus, there was this huge statue of Domitian himself. These are the only two pieces that have been discovered that still remain to this day of this large statue. I mean, you've got to look at that forearm and hand. That's almost 1.5 meters tall. So you can imagine how big a statue it was. It was right at the front port. It welcomed everyone as they entered Ephesus. And of all the cities in the whole Roman Empire, only one of them had a temple dedicated to Domitian, and that was located in Ephesus. So that was his space, that was his place, and it was a place he went to frequently to get away from Rome. Now, in these games that he had brought about, now, again, his father and brother weren't interested particularly in doing anything other than what they did with the Colosseum, and that is just to set up these gladiatorial games and just be done with it and let them all fight and everybody would cheer. And then they'd also do shows in there as well. It wasn't just gladiatorial fights. They would do full-on reenactments of wars and battles. So it was a large open theater per se. But with the games, there was something different. There were competitions. And not only that, but Domitian required everyone to bring representatives from every region of the Roman Empire. And you had to send your athletes, in a sense, to it. And you need to be represented. You need to send leaders to represent your peoples, your region. And the way it began, a very interesting way of it beginning. The games basically followed in this manner. Domitian would sit on a large white throne. The 24 seers or priests, they would all wear white and have gold kind of crowns on their head. And then they'd enter the arena praising the emperor, reciting in particular, the prophecy of what's his name? The Roman poet that now has escaped my head, but Virgil. Thank you. My head has responded. They would enter the arena praising the emperor and quoting, Virgil. They would then take their place at the foot of the throne, just below Domitian, and then following them would be the representatives of all the kind of like, when we think of the Olympic Games today, it's exactly like that. They would come in and all the nations with their standards, in our case it's flags, we would have our flags, and they would come up with all their athletes behind them, and they'd pass right in front of Domitian. And before they would pass him, they would stop before the throne, and the emperor would address him publicly. Domitian would hold up a scroll, and you can see in this photo the scroll which has all his names, the names of his authority, of his godship. This was only the scroll that only he could hold. He would hold up the scroll, all his divine names. It was a symbolic sign of his rule, in a sense. And he would say to them in this manner, which is really interesting. He would say, "You of Galatia and of the Galatian province, I like what you're doing here, good. But in this area, you're not doing good. Do something about it, or I'll deal with you personally." He would pass judgment on each province or nation that would come by in front of the throne in a tone that Jesus uses to address the churches. So when you read the book of Revelation, it has no impact on us. But when you read especially those 7 letters to the churches could absolutely see what was being said here and where it was coming from. After the address of the games, the main event was what they called the quadriga. If you've watched Ben-Hur, you know what I'm talking about here, but the quadriga is a 4-horse chariot race. That was the main race, and the start of the race would begin with the blowing of all these trumpets, or actually 7 trumpets, and the chariots were drawn by the 4 horses, and each horse was colored differently. Like I said, they were called the quadriga, which means the 4 horses, or the foursome, basically. In Domitian's day, there was actually a famous guy called Pontius Scorpus, and he was considered, I guess, depending on who you like in Formula One, Lewis Hamilton or Max Verstappen, I'm not sure, but Pontius Scorpus was considered one of those 2 guys. He'd won something like over 2,000 races. But you can see in this drawing, in this tiled mosaic, what it would have looked like, the 4 horses of 4 different colors, and they then raced. Now, if you have ever read the book of Revelation, and if anything I've said is not familiar to you, then I don't doubt that you've read the book of Revelation, but all this symbology will come up, and I'm going to point back to a lot of this, because in context it makes sense when you understand where the imagery of the book of Revelation actually comes from. Now, that's just a very quick overview of the historical account, along with some of the political intrigues and the cultural issues that were occurring at the time. And it's a lot. I mean, it's almost 30 minutes of giving you all of that. But I want to end this episode really quickly just with what is this book actually about. And I'm going to address this really simply. First of all, it's one revelation. It's not revelations. Now, we need to understand this. When we're looking at revelation, it's only one revelation, and actually what the book is about is actually stated straight away in verse 1 of chapter 1. It says this, Apocalypse Jesus Christos, which means, literally translated, the revelation of Jesus Christ. the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now we read that, and if you look in your NIV Bible and other Bible translations, they will say revelation from Jesus Christ. But actually, if we're going to look at this literally, it might make sense that in English we say revelation from Jesus Christ, but actually it's the revelation of Jesus Christ. The seven churches are being revealed the expectations of Jesus. The world coming to an end comes with the revelation of Jesus. The end times, Revelation chapter 21, when we've gone through all of this, he is the one, the revelation of the one who sits on the white throne is not Domitian, it's Jesus Christ. The new Jerusalem and the new earth will come on the back of the revelation of Jesus Christ when he is revealed to all. This is what the book of Revelation is actually about. And while there's all this symbiology, and it's going to be fun because it is fun to get through and get deep into the weeds of this book, but we need to keep in mind that while we might get fixated on certain things, whether it be 666 or the seven letters to the churches or the new earth and the new Jerusalem, all these things, what this book is all about is the revelation of Jesus Christ. It is revealing Christ to the world. This is it. This is the basis, the basic foundation of this book. Next week, we'll get stuck into chapter 2. I'll give a quick overview of chapter 1, which just kind of introduces John and the initial revelation, and then hitting with the first church, which is Ephesus. That will be out next week. Take care.